And I think that more or less that both players had seen this position in their mind's eye when Frank Marshall played on his seventh move, c5. And of course, the last seven moves have been just complete a bloodbath here. Everybody's been capturing everybody. And of course, now that the dust has settled, we've gone from an opening straight to an ending. And at first glance, it looks like Alekhine has come out the better for this because he's up a pawn. Right? He has 6 pawns, and white has 6 pawns, and black only has 5 pawns. But I think that Marshall was absolutely correct in his judgment that this does not really furnish white with a significant or meaningful advantage, if any advantage at all, because if we look at these pawns are broken on the queen side. The c pawn is an isolated pawn, and not only is it an isolated pawn, but it is on a semi-open file. And so it's going to be very easy for black to attack it with his rook, maybe even double rooks, and it's very hard to secure it in the long run. So I think the c3 pawn is going to drop. If black concentrates his forces on it, it's going to drop. And in addition, this a pawn, if this rook just comes over to c1 too casually, then this a pawn is also under observation by the bishop. And essentially that black at the moment has better placed pieces. You can compare the bishop on e6 to the bishop on f1. He's ahead in development, right? He has 2 pieces developed against 1. Also, it's his turn. So not only is he already ahead in development, but it's his turn, so he's going to become further ahead in development. And he plays a very logical move, rook c8. And so I think Frank Marshall said, hey, okay, I'm giving up a pawn, but I'm liquidating to an ending where I'm going to have a development advantage. I have pressure on both of these pawns, on a2, on c3. One of them is going to probably drop. And then I'll have a 2 versus 1 majority on the queen side, and so I'm very happy. Now Alekhine had also envisioned this position in his mind's eye, and so what was he so happy about? Well, this is what I think is very interesting. So he plays bishop d3. Now when you play bishop d3, I think for a lot of club level players, it looks like the next move is castles kingside. And so Marshall castles kingside, and perhaps he was just expecting white to automatically castle on the kingside as well. I think sometimes we have a tendency to make certain assumptions in chess, and when somebody makes a move that enables castling, and then it's our turn to castle, and then I think we sometimes can just assume then the next player will castle. But here is where Alekhine started to do something a little bit unexpected that I think was part of his plan the whole time, and that I think is quite instructive and interesting and educational. So first he plays knight d4. Okay, now that move on its own doesn't seem, shocking or anything, because he's putting his knight on a central square, and he's trying to get the bishop. Of course, black does not want white to take the bishop on e6. Not only would that leave white with a better minor piece, because the bishop is usually better than the knight, and particularly in a position like this where it's an open board, there's no locked pawns, there's no outposts, obvious outposts for the white knight, and the bishop is exerting pressure along the entire open board as a long-range piece. Here I think it's pretty clear the knight would be better than the bishop. And of course it's a little inconvenient for black because he doesn't want to take this knight either. That would tremendously improve white's pawn structure. Now he would be just a clear pawn up with no compensation for black whatsoever, because this pawn, instead of having a weak backward pawn on c3, he now has the spearhead of a very nice pawn chain, the d4 pawn. So knight d4, okay, but black plays bishop d5, and now of course it looks like high time for white to castle. You got your knight d4 in, okay, but now the bishop is on d5, it's attacking g2, and the most natural looking move is just castles. But no, f3. Well, okay, knight e5, double attack. I attack your bishop, I attack your pawn. Only one way to defend both of these. And obviously it had to be something that Alekhine had seen in advance and was part of his plan the whole time. King d2. So there's a rule in chess, and by a rule I should say maybe more like a guideline, something that is known to be very effective through the study of chess history and through the accumulated data of all these games, which is that the king in the endgame is often most strongly placed in the center. So you can see, like, this king is performing a lot of sort of consolidating functions for its centralized pawns and pieces. It's protecting them, and it's lending them extra support. Whereas the black king is sort of off in the hinterlands. It's very safe, of course, on g8. It's not going to come under any kind of attack. Whereas the white king still might come under some attack. So, one needs to judge these things quite precisely, because what exactly an endgame is versus a late middle game, you want to be careful when you put your king in the middle of the board that even though there might be a reduction in pieces, the king could still come under attack even from just a few pieces. And I think that this phase of the game is where Alekhine really outplays Marshall. And I think that this is why he was okay with going into this variation, because he understood that, okay, maybe black is going to recover his pawn, but I'm going to be able to activate my king. And we're going to see that that makes a very significant difference. So rook c5.